It was November 24th, and I remember recording that episode thinking, this feels like a calm before something. We talked about Chris Paul and what it looked like at the beginning of his farewell lap. Not a loud farewell, not a victory parade, but the quiet kind. The kind older players get when the league keeps moving and you're trying to find your last piece of footing in it. And in that same night, almost as a footnote, we brought up Giannis. Not because there were rumors, not because anyone said anything, but because his contract, Milwaukee's roster, their aging curve, and the pressure of another early playoff exit, all of it felt like a pot simmering just below a boil. You could ignore it if you wanted to, but you could also feel something shifting underneath the surface. It was subtle then, nothing more than a thread in a conversation, a note in the margin of the season. But the thing about this league, especially in December, is that the calendar doesn't just flip, it sharpens. It tests teams, it exposes timelines, and it forces decisions people aren't ready to make. And today, those threads that we talked about on November 24th pulled tight at the exact same moment. Chris Paul has been told he's no longer with the Clippers. No ceremony, no final lap, just you're not with the team anymore. And Giannis? He finally sat down with Milwaukee to talk about his future, something the league has whispered about for years, but never really confronted. And then hours later, he suffers a non-contact injury that sucked the air out of the entire night. 2 players, 2 legacies, 2 franchises trying to hold on to something they're not sure that they can fix. And whether they wanted it or not, whether any of us were ready or not, both just stepped directly into a crossroads. The kind teams spend years trying to avoid. The kind careers eventually have to face. The kind that fans talk about for decades. So this morning, it isn't about panic. It isn't about shock value. It's not even about predictions. It's about clarity. What happened with Chris Paul? Why it happened with the Clippers? What's real with Giannis Antetokounmpo? And what the Bucks are actually up against now. No speculation, no guessing, just the truth. And the moment these stories stopped being hypotheticals and became the reality of the 2025-26 season. Let's get into it. But before we jump in, do me a quick favor. Hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify and iTunes, and drop a rating if you're rocking with the show. And look, we're not trying to be Nostradamus here. We're not in the business of predictions or pretending that we're insiders. We're just informed fans who understand how the association operates. And sometimes that means that the things we talk about end up happening a lot sooner than any of us ever really expected. If you've got thoughts on today's crossroads, Chris Paul, Giannis, your team, whatever, the call-in line is always open at 216-452-8813. All right, let's dive in. Let's start in Los Angeles, and let's start with the Clippers, because from the outside looking in, this is wild. Chris Paul came back on a veteran minimum deal, a 1-year commitment built on respect, familiarity, and the idea of ending his career in a place that mattered to him. And in return, the Clippers positioned him as a stabilizing piece for a roster full of big names and even bigger expectations. Instead, they opened the season 6-16. And in the middle of a road trip, not a sit down at home, not a carefully planned transition conversation, they told Chris Paul he's no longer with the team and sent him home. Now publicly, they're saying all the right things. President Lawrence Frank goes on record and says we're not scapegoating Chris Paul. He's not the reason we're 5-16. I take responsibility for that. We'll work with him on the next step of his career. So on paper, they're respecting the vet. They're making sure that the language is soft. They're promising to help with the next steps. But if we're being honest about how this looks and feels, this is anything but a farewell lap. This crosses a line. This is a 40-year-old future Hall of Famer who just told the world this is his last season, getting pulled out of that lineup, pulled off of the road, and basically told, we're done here, a quarter way into that final lap. Chris Paul didn't arrive demanding touches or spotlight or even special treatment. He arrived willing to help, willing to steady a roster that has struggled with identity for years. And when the vision didn't match the results, instead of reworking the system or adjusting the roles, the Clippers removed him from the environment entirely. It's not malicious, but it's not the treatment a player of his resume, professionalism, and history in that building earns either. And that's where this conversation has to shift. Because yes, we're talking about Chris Paul, a Hall of Famer, a leader, a guy who has elevated almost every team he's touched. But we're also talking about the Clippers, a franchise carrying heavy contracts, unclear futures for Kawhi and Paul George, and a core that hasn't proven that it can stay healthy or contend. This decision wasn't about Chris Paul. It was about the Clippers realizing their season is slipping away and making a move that communicates panic more than purpose. And that's why this segment is about this exact thing. Chris Paul did his part. The Clippers didn't hold up theirs. And in the way they handled this moment, they stepped over a line a stable franchise doesn't cross. In segment 2, we're going deeper, not to attack, but to explain. Because there's a bigger story here about the roster construction, expectations, and why the Clippers made a decision that looks less like strategy and more like survival. Let me be clear. I'm not here to fix the Clippers today. We're not drawing up trade deadline plans. We're not pretending this is a roster one tweak away from contention. That's not the assignment. What we are going to do is ask the question nobody in that building seems willing to say out loud. What were they expecting? Because when you look at this roster, honestly, not through hype, not through preseason media days, but through reality, nothing about it said sustainable. Nothing about it said reliable. Nothing about it said built for the long haul. You've got Kawhi Leonard, one of the greatest postseason players alive, but whose body has to be managed with precision. You've got Paul George, a brilliant two-way star, but a player whose long-term contract situation is a massive question mark. Then you've got James Harden, whose effectiveness is entirely dependent on system and environment, and who has bounced from situation to situation because those fits haven't always held up. And then you add Chris Paul, a 40-year-old veteran, respected, polished, responsible, who came in to steady the roster, not to save it. On paper, that isn't a contender. On paper, that's a team that needed everything to go right in order to compete. That's not a strategy. That's a wish. And the thing about building a roster on a wish is that it leaves you no margin for error. When one thing goes wrong, an injury, a cold stretch, a chemistry issue, the whole structure shakes. The Clippers weren't blindsided by a slow start. This wasn't some shocking collapse of a perfectly built team. This was the predictable result of an experiment made up of aging stars, uncertain availability, overlapping play styles, and contracts that lock you into the same problems year after year. And here's where the closure needs to come in. When a roster is this fragile, the first crack, it doesn't stay a crack for long. It becomes a fault line rather quickly. It runs through rotations, through chemistry, through coaching decisions, through the locker room, through every expectation you set back in October. The Clippers didn't just hit adversity. They weren't built to survive adversity. And that's what explains the Chris Paul decision more than anything else. Because when your roster is constructed on a tightrope, the easiest thing to do when you start falling is drop the lightest piece. Chris Paul became that piece, not because he failed, not because he was the problem, but because this organization put itself in a position where symbolic moves feel like solutions, even if they aren't. That's not about basketball. That's about survival. That's about optics. That's about trying to convince yourself you're still in control of a situation that has already slipped away. And Clippers fans, the ones that have lived through Lob City, lived through injuries, through collapses, through rebuilds, through the hype cycles, they have every right to look at this roster and say, what did you think was going to happen? You can't build a championship core out of names. You have to build it out of availability, role clarity, continuity, and trust. And the Clippers haven't had all four of those in the same time in years. And this isn't me attacking the Clippers. This is me respecting the intelligence of their fans. Because to tell people that this roster was built to truly compete, that's not just optimistic. It's a little bit insulting. Aging stars, overlapping timelines, fragile depth, heavy contracts, and no clear path forward. It was always going to lead here. So let's close this segment with the truth that the franchise won't say, but their actions are shouting. This roster was never built for the grind. It was built for the hope of perfect conditions. And the NBA doesn't give anyone perfect conditions. That's the Clippers' reality. And now, they've made their first panic move. Chris Paul just happened to be the easiest piece to remove from the picture. Now, let's reset for a moment, take a break with our friend Dubby, and then we'll shift gears because the Giannis situation is a very different kind of crossroads. Before we shift over to Giannis, let me take a quick second to talk about our friend Dubby, and I'll keep it simple. If you've been at a crossroads about trying Dubby, now's the time. I use it every single day that I record this show, and it's the cleanest energy boost I've ever had. No jitters, no crash, none of that wired, shaky feeling you get from canned energy drinks or soda. Just steady, natural energy that keeps you locked in and actually feels good in your body. It's genuinely the best I've ever felt on a caffeine extract. Better than pop, better than any energy drink that I've ever had tried. And if you want to see what I mean for yourself, head over to w.gg and use the code Round Ball Rants and get 10% off your next order. Okay, back to the show. When we talked about Giannis back in November on the 24th, I'll be honest with you, I was hesitant. I didn't want it to sound like we were trying to start a rumor. I didn't want it to sound like we were chasing clicks or trying to be the first people to toss his name into some hypothetical trade machine. All we did that day was acknowledge the reality. Giannis's contract, Milwaukee's shrinking window, and the way that this roster was trending, all of it pointed towards a moment that the franchise was eventually going to have to confront. And I'll admit something else too. When we finished that episode, my mind, it did start wandering. Not in a reckless way. Not in a let's just stir the pot way. But in a very human way. If Giannis ever did leave Milwaukee, where would he go? What would the league look like? Who becomes a contender? And who becomes a dynasty? But that stayed in my head. We didn't run with it. We didn't say something that wasn't there. We didn't turn that thought into a headline. But fast forward to now, and the conversations are real. Giannis, his camp, and the Bucks are sitting down and talking about his future. Not in a dramatic way, not in a confrontational way, but in a very honest, very serious way about where this franchise is headed and whether that trajectory aligns with the prime years Giannis still has left. But here's the part we absolutely have to clarify because people love to twist this stuff. Giannis Antetokounmpo has not requested a trade. There is no formal demand. There is no ultimatum for the Bucks. There is no get me out of Milwaukee right now. There is nothing like that on record, on background, or in any kind of credible reporting. These are not trade request meetings. These are future meetings. And in today's NBA, where stars understand their leverage better than ever, these meetings happen long before anything becomes official, because they have to. If a franchise waits too long to have these conversations, they lose the ability to actually build a future that matters. So Giannis, he's not being dramatic here. And the Bucks, they're not panicking. This is simply two sides acknowledging that the clock is ticking faster than anyone expected. And then, right in all the middle of this, last night happens. A non-contact right leg injury. Giannis pulls up, grabs at his lower leg, takes a few steps, and then the entire basketball world freezes. Now, the early word is that it's a right calf strain, not an Achilles tear that everyone feared, but there's no timetable yet. And in a moment where the franchise and the superstar are talking about the future, that kind of injury creates an emotional weight that you can't fake. This is the heart of Giannis' story. Two things can be true at the same time. Giannis has not requested the trade, and Giannis and the Bucks are seriously evaluating their shared future. Both of those facts matter. And if you pressed me right now and said, Vincent, what do you think actually happens? I'd tell you the same thing I said back in November. It feels like a split is coming at some point. Whether it's this deadline, this offseason, or a year from now. Not because there's animosity, but because their timelines are starting to drift apart. But this show is not about predictions. Not in that sense. This is not about Giannis to LA or Giannis to San Antonio or any of the noise that's floating around right now. We're not fixing the Bucks. We're not doing the rumor cycle. We're not going to overreach and say what isn't there. This is about clarity. It's about a superstar recognizing that windows don't stay open forever. It's about a franchise trying to balance loyalty with reality. It's about a team that built something special and is now watching the supporting pieces fall away faster than they can replace them. And that's where Giannis stands today. Not angry, not demanding anything, not turning his back on Milwaukee, but standing at a crossroads for the first real time in his career, asking himself, what do the next 5 years of my basketball life look like? Where do I want to spend them? And who do I trust to build that with me? Those are big questions, and they're fair questions. And in our next segment, we're going to zoom out and talk about the Bucks side of this, because that side of the crossroads is just as important, and in some ways, even more complicated. Okay, now let's talk about Milwaukee, because this is where the story becomes more nuanced, and honestly, more human. The Bucks are not the Clippers. This isn't a franchise that never figured it out. This isn't a franchise that wasted a superstar's prime with indecisions or bad planning. The Bucks did everything right. They built it the right way. They built it around a homegrown superstar. They invested in defense, length, chemistry, and continuity. And they cashed out all of it for a championship. The kind of title run every small market dreams of, but almost never achieves. They climbed the mountain, they reached the summit, and that banner will always hang. But here's the part people miss when they talk about the Bucks like they're falling apart. The NBA changed underneath them. This league has entered an era of extreme parity. We've had 5 different champions in 5 years. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the ecosystem of the league has shifted. The new CBA tightened financial rules. The apron restrictions punished teams for overspending on veteran cores. Flexibility became the new currency. Depth became more important than star power. And the ability to constantly refresh a roster became more valuable than having the perfect roster just one time. You can re-sign your star. You can even re-sign your second star. The rules allow you to keep your core intact. But what the rules don't allow anymore is keeping your stars, your key role players, your veteran glue guys, your full bench, and enough flexibility to adjust when things start breaking down. That's the part the national conversation often glosses over. Adding Damian Lillard wasn't a mistake. Trading Jrue Holiday wasn't a disaster. Re-signing Chris Middleton wasn't blind loyalty. And keeping Brook Lopez wasn't nostalgia. These were the right bets for the window that they thought they were still in. But windows don't stay open because you want them to. They stay open because your roster can withstand the league catching up to you. But the league caught up to the Milwaukee Bucks. Middleton battled with injuries and age. Lopez aged out of his peak form. Holiday left in the Dame deal and ended up strengthening a rival. Role players moved on. The bench thinned out. And every year the roster got a little bit older, a little bit slower, and a little less dynamic. This wasn't mismanagement. This was entropy. The natural erosion that happens in professional sports when a great run ends and the supporting structure starts to wear down. And here's the truth that nobody likes to say out loud. Milwaukee didn't fail Giannis, but they also can't promise him what they once could. Not because they can't try, not because they don't want to make moves, or not because they become complacent, but because the NBA of 2021 is not the NBA of 2025. The Bucks built a champion in one era and found themselves trying to defend it in a completely different one. So here they are now, a proud franchise with a loyal superstar standing at the edge of a decision neither side ever wanted to face this soon. Can the Bucks still build a championship-level roster around Giannis? Not just a playoff team, not just a good team, but a true contender in a league that moves this fast? And on the other side, Giannis has to ask, can I spend the last 5, 6, 7 years of my prime waiting for the roster to catch up? Or is the responsible move for me, for my legacy, for the franchise I love, to explore another path? That's the crossroads. Not drama, not dysfunction, not failure. Just the reality of a league where windows open and close faster than ever before. The Clippers are in a panic because their window was never real. The Bucks are in a reflection because their window was real, and now it's changing shape. And that brings us to the bounce. Because these two stories, as different as they are, share something deeply human. Man, when you lay these two stories side by side, Chris Paul and Giannis Antetokounmpo, it becomes obvious that even though they landed on the same morning, they live in completely different emotional worlds. Chris Paul has lived at a crossroads for almost 2 decades. He's had to reinvent himself in New Orleans, redirect himself after the vetoed Lakers trade, redefine himself in Lob City, reset himself in Houston, revive himself in Oklahoma City, chase one more chance in Phoenix, and reshape himself again in Golden State and Los Angeles. Crossroad after crossroad after crossroad. And every time the question got heavier. Who am I now, and who am I becoming next? That's what aging does. Not in a sad way, but in an honest way. Aging isn't losing ability. Aging is gaining clarity. Chris isn't choosing teams anymore. He's choosing endings. He's choosing how he wants the final chapter of his career to feel when he looks back on it. And Giannis? this is his first real crossroad. He's not standing here because the league changed. He's not standing here because the Bucks made mistakes. He's not standing here because his teammates declined or the CBA shifted or the roster thinned out. Those things contributed, sure, but they aren't the core. Giannis is standing here because he changed. He knows what winning feels like. He knows what carrying a franchise feels like. He knows what it means to grow from a project into a legend. And he knows for the first time in his career that staying somewhere and growing somewhere aren't always the same thing. So you've got one player asking, how do I finish? And another asking, where do I grow? Two different players, two different timelines, two different versions of the same truth. And this is the heart of today's episode, the part that matters long after the news cycle will move on. Life doesn't give you a crossroad because life is changing. Life gives you a crossroad because you are changing. We've all felt that. The job that once fit perfectly suddenly feels too small. The friendship you relied on, it starts fading. The place you called home stops being the place that helps you grow. The version of yourself that once made perfect sense starts to feel like something you've outgrown. Not because anything failed, not because anyone wronged you, not because the world shifted, but because you did. Chris Paul is learning that at the end of a career, and Giannis is learning that at the height of one. And if you're listening to this right now, there's a good chance you've lived in that moment too. The moment where the familiar stops fitting and the future starts calling. That's the power of a crossroads. It's not a punishment. It's not a warning sign. And it's definitely not a dead end. It's proof that you're evolving. And the path that you choose next, the path is the one that honors who you're becoming, not who you used to be. I'm Vincent Cooper. This was Round Ball Rants. Thank you for sharing this moment with me. And remember, it's not just basketball. It's therapy with a bounce.